Chapter 17. Flanked by an escort of a dozen Aridi warriors, the small party followed Seladin as he led the way toward the center of the town, where the Khedive, official residence of the Wakir, was located. As they moved away from the harbor, the cooling influence of the sea breeze, the temperature began to rise. It was a heavy, dry heat, and the three rangers were grateful that they had switched to their new cloaks. The rangers, Horace and Evelyn, kept their eyes straight ahead and befitted the dignity of a diplomatic mission. Svengal felt no such inhibitions and looked curiously around, getting a feel for the town. The approach to the town square was similar to the one he had taken some weeks earlier in Erak's company, even though they had been approaching from the opposite side of the town. The narrow street wound through the same featureless whitewashed buildings. The roofs were flat, and from time to time he saw a curious brown face peering over the balustrades at the small party, no doubt attracted by the solid tramp of the escort's feet on the street. He studied the houses as they passed. There were few windows, balconies, or other openings looking out onto the street, but now he had seen the inside of the guest house, and he realized that the Aridi houses tended to look inward into the shaded central courtyards where the inhabitants relaxed. They arrived at the open space of the town square, and as they passed out of the narrow street into the wide sea, Svengal noted the wooden barricade hinged back against the wall on either side. Obviously, they were a permanent installation. Pity he hadn't noticed them last time, he reflected, or realized their significance. Seladin led them across the square. The fountain that Svengal had noticed on his previous visit was now running, and he could hear the musical splash of falling water. Funny how just the sound of running water made a man feel a little cooler somehow, he thought. He was about to share his insight with the others, but for the first time he noticed their fixed, unwavering expressions and realized that this might not be the time for idle chit-chat. They stepped into the cool shade of the colonnaded terrace. The massive brass-bound doors were open this time, and Seladin stood to one side, gesturing for them to precede him. His troops fanned out to either side of the door. Evelyn led the way in, with Holt a pace behind her. Gillen, Will, and Horace walked three abreast, and Svengal hurried to catch up with them, falling in step with Horace. "Quite a place they've got," the young warrior grinned at him. After the hard morning light outside reflected from the multitude of white buildings, it was dim inside, and it took a few seconds for their eyes to adjust. But it was pleasantly cool as well, Svengal noted gratefully. They were alone in a vast room, obviously the Wakir's audience hall. Around three sides of the rooms were second-floor galleries. There were doors to yet more rooms visible, but the central hall itself took up an entire two-story height of the building. It extended upward to a vaulted roof, where cleverly designed glazed openings and baffles allowed indirect light to enter the room without incurring the penalty of the heat that would come with direct sunlight. The walls were painted in ubiquitous white, while the floor was tiled in elaborate mosaics with an overall bright blue pattern. The coolness of the tiles underfoot seemed to radiate upward, contributing to the comfortable temperature inside the large room. The fourth side of the room, the one that they were facing, was the site where the Wakir received delegations. There was a tall wooden chair, carved in intricate patterns and much decorated with gilt and red paint, standing in a central position on a slightly raised dais. Several low benches, presumably those for those seeking audience, were arranged to either side. Evelyn stopped a few paces into the room, waiting for further developments. She looked straight ahead, knowing that it would be a mistake to turn for Holt for advice. That would show an unseen observer that she was unsure of herself and not in command of this expedition. She knew that if Holt wanted to give her advice, he would do so in an unobtrusive way. For the moment, he was content to follow her lead. He stopped half a pace behind her, to the right, and the others halted as well. Seladin stepped to her side and said quietly, "The Wakir will be arriving in a few moments." He gestured toward the raised dais. His intent was obvious. They were to move forward and await the Wakir's arrival. When he does, Evelyn said in a clear, carrying voice, we shall join him. Will saw the slight movement of Halt's head, and the ranger nodded approvingly. There was a matter of protocol, and even more importantly, dignity here. They had discussed the local system of rank and nobility on the ship. The Wakir was the local ruler, with authority over the province of Al-Shabaab, and answerable to the Amikir, the national ruler. That made him the equivalent of a baron in Erluin, and since Al-Shabaab province was an important one, the Wakir would be a senior baron, equivalent to someone like Errol. But Cassandra was a crown princess, and far superior in rank to any local ruler. It would not be seemingly for her to wait and stand while the Wakir took his time arriving. Of course, as the head of a delegation, she had to show some deference to his position. She could not, for example, insist that he come to her at the guest house. Stopping here, just inside the entrance to the audience hall, was a compromise that served both her dignity and that of the Wakir. Halt glanced at the Iridi captain as he registered her statement. He thought he saw a small light of approval there as well. It occurred to him that perhaps Evelyn's sense of self-worth and confidence was being tested, and this would probably not be the last time it happened. I shall inform His Excellence, Saladin said. This time Halt was sure there was a slight trace of a smile in the dark face before the tall warrior moved away. He disappeared into one of the many side doors. There would likely be galleries and hallways running the length of the building, Halt thought, as well as offices and rooms for the Wakir's staff. Well done, Halt said to Evelyn in a low voice. She didn't turn to look at him, but from the three-quarter viewpoint he saw her cheekbones move, and she knew that she had allowed a faint smile to touch her face. Wasn't sure what to do, she murmured back to him. Trust your instincts, he told her. She knew more about these things and situations than she realized, he thought. She'd spent years at Duncan's side. When in doubt, he said, be pompous. Don't make me laugh, Halt, she said at the corner of her mouth. I'm nervous as a cat here. You're doing fine, he said. As he said it, a door opened at the rear end of the room, on the left side, and a half-dozen men emerged, led by a man who would only be the Wakir. He was a disappointing figure, Will thought. So far he had only experience of Saladin and his soldiers. They were tall and lean and had the look of trained fighting men about them. The Wakir looked like a clerk, a Hilfman, he thought, remembering his despised antagonist at the Scandian court. The Wakir was a good head shorter than any of the others in his entourage, a head and a half if compared to Saladin, who, as a mere captain of the guard, had brought up the rear. The Wakir was also a little overweight. No, Will corrected himself, he was fat. The fact could not be concealed by the flowing robes he wore, and the face beneath the oversized turban seemed to have been formed from soft clay, modeling hastily to form features with a squashed lump of a nose set in the middle. He looked around uncertainly, saw the Erluin delegation, and took a seat on the carved, decorated chair. He had to sit well forward to make sure his legs actually touched the ground. Had he sat back, they would have swung childlike some 5 centimeters from the polished wood floorboards of the platform. A regular giant, isn't he? Horace muttered out of the side of his mouth. Shut up, Halt replied in the same fashion. Children, Evelyn said quietly in a mocking admonishment. Will regarded her with some admiration. She looked straight-backed and confident. She was handling all this with great skill, and he thought as if she were born into it. Then he shrugged mentally. She had been born into it. For a moment, he had another flash of his own inadequacy. Then, as Evelyn stepped out toward the dais, he hurried to fall in step with the others. Their boots rang on the tiled floor, echoing off the bare walls as they proceeded down the large room. Evelyn stopped just short of the dais, waiting to be announced. Saladin stepped forward between her and the Wakir. Your Excellence, may I present the delegation of Princess Cassandra of the Kingdom of Erluin. Princess, may I present His Excellence Aman Shubdel, Wakir and Overlord of the province of Al-Shabaab. Evelyn inclined her head deeply. She'd been told by Lord Anthony that strict protocol required a woman to curtsy in sort of situation, but she'd told him that she'd be damned if she would. "Excellence," she said, holding the bow for several seconds, then looking up. The Wakir gestured for her to approach, and she stepped toward the low dais instead. "Please be seated, my lady." Evelyn froze in mid-step. A small frown crossed her face. "I am the Crown Princess of Heirloom, Excellence, and such I am addressed as Your Highness, or, if that isn't acceptable to your own dignity, Princess Cassandra would be suitable." Good girl, Halt thought, although his face remained inscrutable as ever. The Wakir seemed a little flustered by her reaction. He glanced to one side for a moment. Evelyn had its distinct impression that he was looking to Celadon for guidance. She had an urge to look at the captain as well, but she knew she must keep her gaze fixed on the Wakir. Of course, a slip of the tongue. Apologies, Princess, Your Highness," he said, waving his hand to dismiss the unintentional gaffe. Please, sit with me." For a moment, Evelyn fought an overwhelming urge to giggle as she wondered what he'd do if she took him literally and dropped up to sit on his knee on the massive carriage chair. She struggled to keep a straight face, forcing herself to regain complete composure. Her hesitation served her well, however, as the Wakir took it as a further sign of her displeasure. He rose from his chair. Will had to smile as he saw how awkward this movement was. The short-legged Aurelie ruler had to slide his behind forward to the edge of the chair, then virtually drop to the floor. Having been shorter than most of the men around him all his life, Will enjoyed seeing someone else struggle with the problem. "Sit, Your Highness, please," he repeated, and Evelyn nodded her consent, moved to a richly upholstered bench that Celadon had placed before her, and sat gracefully. The Wakir nodded. He climbed back aboard his seat, wiggling his backside again to get into position, cast another sideways glance, then licked his lips nervously. Evelyn thought she might as well take charge of matters. "We've come to discuss the ransom of our friend Erak, Oberjarl of Scandia," she said. Her voice was high and clear. "We understand you have a sum for this?" "We have," the Wakir replied. "The sum required is—" Again he hesitated, as if there were a sideways shift to his eyes. Evelyn frowned. The man seemed very unsure of himself, she thought. Then he continued, 80,000 reals of silver. There was a renewed tone of confidence in his voice now, and he spoke the figure, as if it had just been confirmed for him. Evelyn shook her head. "Too high," she said firmly. The Wakir jerked back in his seat in surprise. "Too high," he repeated, and Evelyn nodded. She was conscious of Anthony's briefing on the matter. "They'll expect you to bargain," he had said. "It's virtually an insult if you don't." "We're offering 50,000, Evelyn told him calmly. The Wakir's hand flew to his head in agitated fashion. 50,000, but that's... He hesitated, and Evelyn finished. "Our offer." The Wakir's hand played with his chin, tonguing at the loose flush below it. His eyes took on a crafty look. "Ah, very well. To offer such a low price, Your Highness, but how do I know that you are capable of paying even that much? How do I know that you are authorized?" "You have my seal," Evelyn said simply. She had seen the seal box that she had returned to Celadon the previous day. It was sitting on the side table beside the Wakir's chair. He looked at it now, picked it up, and opened the hinge-top. "Ah, yes, your seal," he said, studying it. "It identifies me as Princess Cassandra of Heirloom," Evelyn replied, and Halt, listening intently, detected the slightest tone of suspicion in her voice. Again, the Wakir fingered his chin. "So you say, but this seal, of course, could belong to—" He looked around the room, waved his hand indefinitely, and finished, "Anybody." Evelyn sat back on her bench for a few seconds, her mind racing. She knew that countries kept a register of official seals, and she knew that Aridi was on the list of countries on which Heirloom had exchanged such information. Before she had left Heirloom, Duncan and Anthony had assured her that in the last exchange some 6 months prior, her seal had been included with Duncan's as a matter of course. The Wakir should know that. If he didn't, it could mean only one thing. Abruptly, she rose from her chair and turned her 5 waiting companions. "Let's go," she said crisply. She didn't hesitate, but strode decisively through them. They hurried to follow in her wake, her boots and heels loud on the tiled floor behind them. There was a buzz of activity on the dais. Will glanced back and saw the Wakir had come to his feet again and was gesturing uncertainly toward Saladin. The captain stepped forward now and called after her, "Princess Cassandra, please wait." Evelyn stopped and turned deliberately. "Wait," she said, and she moved toward her, hands stretched out in imploring gesture. "Why should I wait to be insulted any further? You've had me dealing with an impostor. I'll wait in the guest house, but only as long as the next tide. If the real Wakir doesn't make himself known by then, we are leaving." Saladin hesitated. Then his shoulders relaxed and he smiled ruefully. "My apologies, Your Highness." He turned Tubley, a little finger on the dais. "Thank you, Amon. You did your best." The fake Wakir shrugged discordantly. "I'm sorry, Your Excellence. She caught me by surprise." The suspicion had been growing in Evelyn's mind and was confirmed. She raised an eyebrow at the captain. "Excellence?" she repeated, and he shrugged. "Amon is my consultant," he said, "as I think you just guessed. I am Wakir of Al-Shabaab. Now, perhaps you could come back and we'll begin the negotiation in earnest." Evelyn hesitated. She was tempted to stand on her dignity. Then she thought about Erak and realized that every second of delay would cause him discomfort and uncertainty. "Very well," she said, and walked back to the dais. The 4 Heirloons and Svengal followed her. As they marched back up to the audience hall, Horace leaned down to Will and whispered in his ear, "Is she good at this? Or what?"